1958, Jimmy Bryan eluded disaster in this tragic opening lap accident in turn 3. The race was off to an ominous start. But when the track was cleared, Bryan, Tony Bettenhausen, and George Amy put on a spectacular show. It was anybody's race. But on lap 126, Bryan took control. Pacing the field the rest of the day, Jimmy Bryan took the checkered flag for his first win at Indy. Hello, I'm Bob Jenkins. In a relatively short period of time, Jimmy Bryan became a major figure at Indy. With a cigar in his mouth and a grin on his face, this giant of a man was a presence in the pits and a respected competitor on the track. His tough, hard-charging style helped him to win 3 national championships and the Indianapolis 500. Sadly, Jimmy Bryan lost his life racing at the young age of 33. But though his life was cut short, the legend of Jimmy Bryan lives on at the Indy 500, a race for heroes. A native of Phoenix, Arizona, Jimmy Bryan began racing on the West Coast in 1947 at age 20. After 4 years of racing hot rods and midgets in Arizona and California, Jimmy Bryan made his first trip to Indy. Passing his rookie test in 1951, Bryan qualified for the race but was bumped from the field. Penniless and committed to staying in the Midwest, it's said that Bryan found a shopping cart and picked up empty soda bottles to cash in on the deposits. Bryan enjoyed moderate success in '51, winning some sprint races on the East Coast. And when it was time to try Indy again, he was up to the challenge. Freddie Agabashian took the pole driving the Cummins diesel. Chet Miller set new 1- and 4-lap qualifying records at a Novi. And without much fanfare, rookie Jimmy Bryan secured the 21st starting position. Jack McGrath jumped out to an early lead, but the race soon turned into a 2-man duel. Bill Vukovich and Troy Ruttman battled all day, each taking turns in the lead. Ruttman survived this fire during an early pit stop to remain in contention, and he eventually won the race as a steering pin broke in Vuki's car, sending him into the third turn wall just 8 laps from the finish. Jimmy Bryan never was much of a factor, but ran a steady race. He finished 6th, just missing becoming Indy's first Rookie of the Year. That honor went to 5th place finisher Art Cross.
Jimmy was a neat guy, liked to water ski and fish, and he lived in Phoenix, and just quite a guy. Bare bones, tough, rough guy. Another guy with a lot of raw talent. Now, if you talk about dirt drivers, you know, he was one of the best.
1953 arrived with the promise of a new year and high expectations. Bryan managed to improve his qualifying time, but this year he would start from the last row. On race day, pole sitter Bill Vukovich led 195 out of 200 laps to take the win as Bryan struggled along, finishing 14th. Although the '53 race was a disappointment, Jimmy Bryan did manage to post his first championship-level win that year in Sacramento. And when he returned to Indy in 1954, he was with a new team driving a better car. Bryan's new team was Dean Van Lines, and while several drivers were switching to the Roadsters, which would dominate IndyCar racing for the next decade, Bryan would be driving an older model dirt car. In qualifications, Jack McGrath took the pole, becoming the first driver to break the 140-mile-an-hour barrier. Jimmy Daywalt qualified second best. And Bryan, driving the Dean Van Lines dirt car, completed the front row. It turned out to be his best starting position ever. Race day, Jack McGrath held on to the top position through the first 44 laps, with heavy pressure from Jimmy Daywalt, Art Cross, 1953 winner Bill Vukovich, and Jimmy Bryan. After McGrath's first pit stop of the day, several drivers took turns in the lead. And on lap 63, Jimmy Bryan moved to the front of the pack. Holding off challenges from the Roadsters, Bryan led the race in the Dean Van Lines dirt car for 26 laps, not yielding his position until hitting the pits on lap 89. Back on the track, Bryan continued the chase for his first Indy win. Bill Vukovich was now in first, establishing himself as the man to beat. Jack McGrath was still competitive as well. With Vukovich heading for the pits, Jimmy Bryan once again took the lead on lap 130. He held on as McGrath faded and Vukovich gained. And though he was in the lead, Bryan was having problems. Suffering throughout the day were several minor malfunctions he was wearing down physically. By lap 150, Vukovich was back in the lead. Indy's brick-paved oval was tough on drivers under normal conditions, and Bryan was taking extra punishment in his dirt car. Late in the race, with Vukovich well out in front, Bryan lost his right rear shock. Through sheer brute strength, he was able to control the car and hold on for second place. Exhausted and beaten from the race, Bryan collapsed in his garage. Although no serious physical damage was done, Bryan's condition forced him to miss the next championship race that year. He would be ready for Indy in 1955. Strong, winning the national championship and the coveted #1. And when he returned to Indy in '55, the Dean Van Lines team had a new car. The dirt car was gone, replaced by a more competitive Kuzma Roadster. Starting from the 11th spot, Bryan patiently worked his way to the front of the field as Jack McGrath and Bill Vukovich fought for the lead. Bryan moved all the way up to second place. Sadly, on lap 57, race leader Bill Vukovich crashed, receiving fatal injuries. The race was stopped. Shortly after the restart, Bryan was in the lead. With Bob Swikert in tow, Bryan paced the field for 30 laps. But his car began to slow down. On lap 90, with smoke pouring out the back of the car, he was forced out of the race. Always the showman, Bryan drove into the pits, sitting on the tail, steering with his feet. Disappointed, the fiery Bryan assessed the damage, then kicked his car in disgust. With his trademark cigar in his mouth, Jimmy Bryan would sit this one out as Bob Swikert went on to win. In '56, time trials were slowed by rain. Bryan, despite his continued success with Dean Van Lines, was only able to qualify 19th. Early in the race, Jim Rathbun, Pat O'Connor, Paul Russo, and Pat Flaherty each took turns in the lead. Trying to catch the leaders, Jimmy Bryan spun out of contention, was towed back into the pits, then returned to the race. 15 laps behind the leaders, Bryan was still running at the end in 19th place. Despite his poor showing at Indy, Jimmy Bryan found continued success on the championship circuit, winning the 56th national title. During the offseason, the Speedway's trademark pagoda became another one of the retired legends of Indy. Aging and structurally unsound, the pagoda was replaced by a new control tower and pit area. In qualifications, Pat O'Connor took the pole before rain washed out the first day. Paul Russo, driving a Novi, later established the fastest average for the year. Jimmy Bryan, bearing the number 1 reserved for the national champ, qualified 15th. In this era when men race cars because they loved it, not because they expected to get rich, most drivers would rent rooms with local families. Jimmy Bryan stayed with the Otte family in Speedway for several years. It was a system that worked well for both the drivers and the families, with the drivers saving some money and the families making some money. Besides the drivers and team members, it wasn't unusual to have a trailered race car in front of your house and to be the envy of the other kids on the block. For the drivers, an additional convenience was being able to walk to the track, or as Jimmy Bryan did in '57, take a motorbike. Pat O'Connor outraced Eddie Sachs and Freddie Agabation at the start to take an early lead. 52 winner Troy Ruttman started out fast as well. Sam Hanks, driving a new design layover offie for Balland exhaust, was catching up from the 13th position. By lap 36, he was leading. Hanks began to dominate, with challenges coming from Jim Rathman and Paul Russo. Jimmy Bryan remained well back, out of the picture, but not completely out of the race. On lap 135, Hanks took the lead from Rathman, never to give it back as he drove the new Balland exhaust roadster to victory. Rathman took second, and although he was never in position to win, Jimmy Bryan's persistence was rewarded with third place. In this race, the top 10 finishers broke the previous record for 500 miles. Despite his less than spectacular record at Indy, Jimmy Bryan became part of an international racing challenge in 1957. In what was billed the Race of Two Worlds, several Indy 500 cars and drivers were to be matched up against top European competition in Monza, Italy. As it turned out, almost all of the European drivers refused to compete. The field included Pat O'Connor, Eddie Sachs, Tony Bettenhausen, Paul Russo, and Indy winners Johnny Parsons and Troy Ruttman. But Jimmy Bryan stole the show. Winning 2 out of 3 events, Bryan was declared the overall winner. Back in the States, Bryan continued his long-running domination of the championship circuit, winning his 3rd national title in 4 years. He was still looking for his first victory at Indy. 1957 Indy winner Sam Hanks went into immediate retirement after his victory, leaving the Ballon team with a capable car, needing a capable driver. Still looking for his first Indy win, Jimmy Bryan left Dean Van Lines after the 57 season. He would drive for Ballon in 58. This was the second year of a new starting procedure where the cars were lined up single file in the pits. Once the engines were fired up, the plan was to have the cars drive onto the track, falling into their starting positions behind the pace car. It didn't work. The entire front row of Dick Rathman, Ed Alesian, and Jimmy Reese were erroneously placed ahead of the pace car. And when it was time for the green, the field was not ready, forcing an extra warm-up lap.
And now the front row has joined them.
This time around, everything was set, and when the green flag fell, Rathman and Alesian fought for the lead.
And the race is on. The race is on. The front row has joined them, and the race is on. Let's wish them well as they move out on the first lap of competition.
Third turn, Alesian spun, taking Rathman into the wall, starting a massive pileup. Pat O'Connor, running fifth, flipped, receiving fatal injuries. Catapulted over the wall. When the smoke cleared, 15 cars were involved, 7 were eliminated.
Their leader has been, throughout this series of accidents, Jimmy Bryan in car number 1.
Somehow, Jimmy Bryan worked his way through the mess to take the lead as the yellow caution flag came out. The race did not stop, and for the first half hour, Jimmy Bryan held the lead under caution. Finally, the track was cleared, and the green flag came out. In spite of the tragic, confused beginning and a depleted field, this race was as competitive as ever. Tony Bettenhausen quickly took the lead from Bryan, with rookie George Amick charging up from behind. Bryan, Bettenhausen, and Amick went wheel to wheel, trading the lead 12 times between them. On lap 66, Bryan took the top spot from Tony Bettenhausen and held on. For 38 laps, Bryan paced the field, the first time anyone could show a decided advantage. With Bryan in the pits, Bettenhausen, then Johnny Boyd, took turns in the lead. But by lap 126, Bryan was back on top. Rookie A.J. Foyt, Bryan's replacement of the Dean Van Lines car, provided some excitement spinning on lap 148. While Bryan extended his lead, lapping the entire field at one point. George Amick eventually unlapped himself, but Bryan easily took the checkered flag, waving to the crowd with his patented both hands in the air salute. He finished 27 seconds ahead of Amick, who was later named Rookie of the Year. Jimmy Bryan's move to the Ballon exhaust team in 1958 coincided with his decision to quit driving the national circuit. He did continue to drive stocks, some sports cars, and in 1959 he returned to Indy to defend his win. Having trouble getting his car in gear, Bryan started the race in the pits, and after completing one very slow lap, he was out. George Sally, owner and builder of the 57 and 58 winner, built a new car for Bryan in 1960. It was smaller and lighter than most cars at the time, a trend that would eventually take hold. Unfortunately, the new car just wasn't competitive. Bryan dropped out after 152 laps with a failed fuel pump. It was his last appearance at Indy. After the 1960 500, Jimmy Bryan decided to return to the championship circuit. As a one-race substitute for Roger Ward, Bryan qualified for the race at Langhorne, Pennsylvania, a tough dirt track Ward had refused to drive for several years.
I would not run at Langhorne, and he came to me a few days before the race, a week or 10 days, and he says, I understand you're not going to run Langhorne. I says, that's right, I don't run there. He says, well, A.J. Watson said that if it was okay with you, he would take the race car and I could drive it. And I said, Jimmy, I'd really rather that you wouldn't. And he says, well, you know, I like that racetrack. I run very well there. I said, but Jimmy, this is a crossbar car and it handles differently than you're used to. I said, I just don't think the car would be safe there. And he says, well, he says, I really would like to. And I said, well, you know, I can't tell you no. But I says, I wish you'd reconsider. And he says, well, I'll, you know, tell me how to drive it. And I said, well, okay. And I explained to him a little problem that the car had. And he says, well, I'll kind of keep my eye on that. So he qualified outside in the front row. And on the first lap of the race, going for the lead, he made a little mistake, or he got into the ruts and the car got upside down, and he would not wear a shoulder harness, which wasn't the law then. And of course the car killed him. And I was in another race in New York, and you know, it was one of those things. I hated that race car from then on, and I had won the championship in it the year before, and it was a good race car, but I mean, suddenly I just hated that race car, and I made A.J. build me a new one the next year.
Starting from outside the front row, Bryan never completed the first lap. His car flipped through turn 2, and at age 33, Jimmy Bryan lost his life. From his first years at Indy, Jimmy Bryan made his presence known. Though he did not find immediate success on the track, his swaggering style and childlike enthusiasm quickly made him a popular figure with fans as well as opposing drivers.
Him and Bill Cheeseburger, they always carried them cherry bombs, and they'd catch people, poor old people at a stoplight or something, light one, throw in their car. People almost jump out and scream. I'll never forget that. But they were pretty good-sized boys, so if somebody wanted to jump on them, they could protect themselves. But I'll never forget that. They used to, everywhere they went, they had the cherry bombs.
I had a lot of fun with Jimmy. We'd travel together and go to the races and whatnot, and Jimmy was one heck of a race driver. He was a real hard, dedicated, he was what you call a real racer. He's in a category with Troy Ruttman and Vukovic.
Everybody, you know, that was an aspiring race driver, I'll put it that way, you know, we looked up to Jim as our hero, and of course he was, you know, he was good. He was national champion, so that just lifted him a little higher as far as we were concerned. But he was tough, and of course, anytime they had any races, you know, 3A or USAC races in that area, well, we were all there, you know, trying to get the hot setup, watching him, everything he did. He probably did a lot for cigar sales in Arizona. we even thought maybe that'd help us, you know.
In a race few have won and fewer still have become legends, Jimmy Bryan made his mark at the Indy 500, a race for heroes.